For my second 1920s book review, I chose a more famous one, A Passage to India by the British author E.M. Forster, originally published in 1924. Forster, by that time, was a veteran writer who had achieved success across nearly 2 decades, and even though he would live all the way until 1970, this would be the last novel he published in his lifetime. First, let's go through the story quickly. A Passage to India is set in India in a fictional town called Chandrapur during the British colonization period, based on Forster's own experience of traveling there on 2 separate occasions. Perhaps the most important place to the British people there is the British Club, which acts as a sort of social club as well as a place to play light sports. The relationship between colonizer and colonized in Chandrapur is what you might expect. The British who are part of the colonizing force are portrayed as arrogant, and they look down upon their Indian subjects. Many of the British civilians who come to Chandrapur also have tendencies to see Indian society as uncivilized, and a step, or rather many steps, below their native Britain. This mindset is perfectly captured in a line from the story, where one of the British women talks about the activities of the Indians, quote, as if she was describing the movements of migratory birds, end quote. And the Indians generally dislike the British and the fact that they are being subject to colonialism. The same British woman that I just mentioned, Mrs. Turton, was also shocked to learn that many of the Indians spoke English, with the obvious implication that she, as well as the other minor English characters, thought that they were incapable or too uncivilized to do so. Our main character is Aziz, a young Muslim Indian doctor. He is traditional and conservative and a proud follower of his religion, something with which he finds difficulty compromising with others, especially the English, but also with the Hindus. The biggest representation of the British colonizers is Rani Hislop, the magistrate of Chandrapur, who is viciously disdainful towards the Indians. His mother is Mrs. Moore, who is fond of many of the Indians, especially Aziz, and is genuinely interested in Indian society and culture. And there's also Mr. Fielding, who is the headmaster of a small college. And there's also Adella, who comes to India to marry Rani after his mother, Mrs. Moore, set them up. She shares Mrs. Moore's interest in seeing the real India, and doesn't have anything against the Indians. Aziz befriends Mrs. Moore after an awkward run-in with her at his favorite mosque, where he was actually quite rude, though I'll get into that more later. He also becomes friends with Mr. Fielding, who is very tolerant and understanding of the Indians, though he doesn't quite share the same enthusiasm for learning about its culture and society like Mrs. Moore and Adela. However, Aziz is apparently unable to become close with Adela, partly because she is planning to marry Rani Hislop, who is the main villain on the British side. And the other reason is pretty shallow, to be honest. He finds her deeply unattractive. This excerpt explains what he first thought of her. He wondered how God could have been so unkind to any female form. His attitude towards her remained entirely straightforward in consequence. But nonetheless, Aziz and Adela remained on good terms for the time being, just not particularly close. After a few social gatherings in the first half of the book, we get to see what the characters think about each other. Then Aziz invites a small group to go to the Marabar Caves to do some sightseeing. Among this group is Mr. Fielding, Mrs. Moore, and Adela. The expedition is by all accounts disappointing, and no one is particularly happy about it. It's a long journey out to the caves, and they really aren't all that interesting. At one point, Aziz finds himself alone with Adela, but because they are not good conversation partners, there is little dialogue between them. Adela finds herself thinking about her impending marriage with Rani, and she is torn about it because she doesn't really love him. Aziz holds her hand, but not in any inappropriate way. In fact, neither of them find the other attractive, and both for rather bad reasons. Adela is unable to find Aziz attractive because he is too exotic, in other words, because of his race. Her thoughts about marriage lead her to ask Aziz about his own, but she angers him when she asks if he has multiple wives, an assumption that Aziz takes personally, though Adela doesn't seem to notice that she upset him. He leaves her for a short time, then returns to find her gone, and finds her broken field glasses on the ground and picks them up. He makes his way out of the cave and finds Fielding. They both find out that Adela had quickly returned back to Chandrapur, but they don't really question why too much. When they return to Chandrapur, Aziz is immediately placed under arrest without an explanation, and he begins sobbing at this hit to his good name and dignity. Fielding, shocked, persistently asks why Aziz was arrested and accuses the British officials of unjust treatment. We find out that the crime Aziz is accused of is forced relations with Adela. Fielding refuses to believe this, since he thinks Aziz to be perhaps the most straight-laced man he knows, or in his words, that he is incapable of infamy. The charges were made by Adela herself. Mr. McBride, the official Fielding is talking to, says that Fielding just doesn't understand Indians like he does, and that there is no such thing as a morally good Indian. And really, we as the reader know for a fact that Aziz is innocent, because the narrator is omniscient, so an unreliable narrator is really impossible. We saw for ourselves Aziz's movements and know that he did absolutely nothing wrong. Ironically, the last interaction Aziz and Adela had was when she made him deeply upset for the mere question of if he were polygamous. So the idea of him actually forcing himself upon Adela is almost inconceivable. So the news spreads to the other Englishmen and women at the British club in Chandrapur. Ronnie Hislop is practically broken, but still functional. Fielding expresses his belief that Aziz is innocent to all the assembled British people, and he voluntarily withdraws his club membership, which would have been taken from him anyway. The fact that he doesn't believe Adela's story, or the possibility that she was mistaken, is unacceptable to the others. This puts Fielding on the side of the Indians, and this whole incident pretty much turns into an us versus them situation. Then we get Adela's version of the story, which is given to us in the form of her thinking about how she will tell the other Englishmen. And it isn't as graphic or even as clear as we were led to believe by the likes of Mr. McBride, who was shaken up by the whole incident. This is what Adela thought in full. I went into this detestable cave, and I remember scratching the wall with my fingernail to start the usual echo. And then, as I was saying, there was this shadow, or sort of shadow, down the entrance tunnel, bottling me up. It seemed like an age, but I suppose the whole thing can't have lasted 30 seconds, really. I hit at him with the glasses. He pulled me round the cave by the strap. It broke. I escaped, that's all. He never actually touched me once. It all seems such nonsense. But then something incredible happens. After Adela visits Mrs. Moore for the first time since the incident, and the old lady expresses her newfound cynical views on life, Adela begins to doubt that it was Aziz who had assaulted her in the caves. She even tells Ronnie this epiphany, but he doesn't quite believe her. Mrs. Moore cynically expresses her belief in Aziz's innocence, which only makes Adela more sure of her mistake. Ronnie tells both to give him more evidence if they have any, but their belief is based on his character alone, so there's nothing they can give. But the news of the incident and the accusation have already spread and caused problems on both the British and the Indian sides. In the words of Mrs. Moore, Adela has, quote, started the machinery. It will work to its end, end quote. There has been a lot of literary debate about this book due to the sensitive subject matter involved, and I'm no expert, but I'm going to give my opinion, so keep in mind that these are not necessarily facts, just my thoughts. There's a kind of irony in the novel that I found interesting. Almost all of the Indian characters disdain, or at least do not sympathize, with the British colonizers, who make up a minority group in India, and all the different faiths of the country are against the British. Yet most of the main Indian characters are made up of Muslims, a minority group among the Indians, while the Hindus, the majority group, are pushed to the background of the story. And the hypocritical part of Aziz's character is that he dislikes Hindus. We don't really get a definite reason why this is, except that he finds them dirty and polluting, which certainly sounds to me like a stereotype more than anything else. You would think that being treated as a lesser being would humble Aziz, as well as others in his community, to things like stereotyping and unfair prejudice, but it seems like this is not the case. There is also another scene in the story that shows this hypocritical tendency of Aziz. When he first meets Mrs. Moore, Ronnie Hislop's mother, in a mosque, he assumes that she is ignorant of Muslim customs and rudely tells her to take off her shoes when inside of a mosque. He hadn't realized that she had already taken off her shoes, so it was all just an assumption on his part. Of course, you can make the argument that the British colonizers had probably repeatedly ignored such a rule for years and had disgraced the holy place with their unclean practices, and that this is what caused resentment from Aziz. But that would be looking outside of the text, so it's really impossible to know for sure. Regardless of that, Aziz does apologize for his quick assumption, and they proceed to have a pleasant conversation. I found this book to be more challenging than the previous book I reviewed, An American Tragedy. To me, at least, Forster seems to write in a more traditional style with sophisticated words, difficult syntax, etc. I'm not sure if the fact that he was British has anything to do with it, since Britain at that time was considered more high-class and intellectual. Some British viewers might find this funny. I know it's an American stereotype that I know at least one exception for, but I wonder if it rings true in this case. Compared with Theodore Dreiser's writing in An American Tragedy, which I guess is the standard I'm going to use for this review, Forster's writing demands more active attention. I was able to read An American Tragedy very smoothly for leisure reading, but I didn't have the same feeling while reading A Passage to India, and I have a couple of reasons for this. First off, the characters and names. There are a lot of characters, even within the group of important ones. There has to be at least double than the average book, at least that's my impression. And because this takes place in India, there are a lot of Indian names. For someone like me who is used to a different culture and language from where the story takes place, these names taken from a vastly different language get kind of muddled together and are harder to remember. So I kept finding myself wondering if a minor Indian character had already been mentioned or is being introduced. And if they had already been mentioned, I no longer knew what they did or what purpose they served to the story. This issue was not helped by the fact that Forster is very sparse with names during long dialogue sequences. This was a very big obstacle that could be quite frustrating for me. I often got lost in dialogue and was unsure who the actions or words were being attributed to. For example, in a conversation among multiple men or multiple women, it would just say, "he did this" or "he said," but the name hadn't been mentioned for a few paragraphs, so there was a lot of backtracking on my part. But anyway, getting back to the story. One of the great ironies of this novel is the fact that Mrs. Moore and Adela came to India to see the real India, as opposed to the British-influenced aspects. But it seems that the British influence is too pervasive in their experience, and is difficult for them, though especially Adela, to completely disregard their own cultural values and norms. And it can be argued that they did in fact see the real India, at least the real India of that specific time. British colonialism was such a big influence, especially with its unjust treatment of the Indians, that you could say that it was the real India. The traditional India had been changed, largely against its will, and this is what it had been turned into. There was also another thought I had, but this might be reaching a bit, I don't know. When the news about Aziz's alleged crime breaks in Chandrapur, all of the British men, except Fielding, do not refer to either Aziz or Adela by name. Instead, they just allude to them. When I read this, I thought that it might be symbolic of the British attitude towards problems in colonial India at that time. By this, I mean that they recognize there are problems, but they don't address them directly, and normal people are told to ignore it and keep on with their normal activities as if nothing was wrong, which is exactly what Mr. McBride tells the Englishwoman to do. Like I said, maybe this is a stretch, but I couldn't help thinking that. One of the most remarkable character changes in the story is that of Mrs. Moore. She had been the shining light among the British people, able to respect and appreciate the Indians and their culture, and was generally all around cheerful and optimistic. But after the incident with Adela, she becomes angry and irritable, with a, quote, "just irritation against the human race," end quote. Ronnie and the other Englishmen persuade Adela to continue the trial through to the end, though she still has reservations. But under oath and tortured by her moral dilemma, Adela admits that she believes she made a mistake, and the judge dismisses the case and all charges against Aziz are dropped. The Indians celebrate this victory, if you can call it that. In Adela's interactions with Indians after the trial, they are uncomfortable, but they don't exactly hate her. Mr. Fielding, on the other hand, though bitter towards her at first, begins to better understand her predicament and even comes to respect her. It's about this time that we learn Mrs. Moore has died. She had been forced to return to England by her son, Ronnie, though she hadn't really wanted to stay in India after what had happened anyway. She represented a mutual understanding among the British and the Indians, and her bitterness and disillusionment echo Forster's pessimistic commentary on the whole subject, and her death means the death of progress in this regard. Meanwhile, Aziz and Fielding interact for the first time since the end of the trial. Aziz's scorn for the British has only increased, and he is completely disassociated from Adela. Fielding tries to convince him that she has redeemed herself, but Aziz does not accept this transformation and is actually quite vindictive against her and wants to sue her. Although he is eventually convinced not to do so, because of this disagreement, Fielding and Aziz have a falling out. Adela leaves India, then soon after, Fielding also leaves, both of them headed back to England. We find out that Fielding married Ronnie Hislop's sister, and near the very end of the novel, it's mentioned that the British authorities in India kept a watch over Aziz for the rest of his life because of the trial. Even though he lived out a relatively happy life, one accusation made against him years ago still hung over him. Aziz and Fielding's relationship is perhaps the most important one in the novel. They quickly grew to like each other in the beginning, but the atmosphere of British colonialism, represented by Aziz's unfair treatment amid the trial, destroys any possibility of them mending their friendship. And aspects of their personalities, influenced largely by their respective cultures, also contributes to this. For example, Fielding's cold logic versus Aziz's poetic imagination often clash, and that's where things end. Forster shows a not very optimistic outlook for the future of Indian-British relations. The themes of a lack of mutual understanding and complete ignorance of each other's cultures are central to A Passage to India. Both sides are pretty uncompromising when it comes to tolerance and indeed acceptance of each other. There is resentment because a clear racial hierarchy has been established, where one, the British, was automatically higher in status than the other, the Indians. In fact, there is yet another piece of irony in this story involving just this. Even though the prospect of cooperation was looking good at first, the incident with Adela, in fact, pushes them further away from each other than ever before. Aziz now seeks cooperation with the Hindus to become a unified India against the British. The novel showcases different types of British people in terms of colonialism. First, there's Mrs. Moore, who wins the respect of the Indians for her sensitive treatment and respect of them. Then there's her son, Rani Hislop, who is pretty much the exact opposite. He despises Indians and India, and only causes their resentment of him and his administration. Then there are the more nuanced cases of Fielding and Adella. Fielding is generally the Indians' ally, though he can never quite be on the same page as them culturally. Adela is naive and ignorant of the situation in India. She inadvertently caused such a mess between the British and the Indians and regrets it deeply. However, she is much more preferable to the other English women, except Mrs. Moore, who are condescending and treat Indian culture as more of a distasteful novelty than anything. At the very end of the novel, Forster sums up his complicated view of the possibility of an Indian-British friendship through Aziz. After proclaiming that India should be unified under all its groups, mainly the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs, he says to Fielding, "Down with the English anyhow, that's certain. Clear out, you fellows, double quick, I say. If it's 50 or 500 years, we shall get rid of you. Yes, we shall drive every blasted Englishman to the sea, and then you and I can be friends." Fielding responds, "Why can't we be friends now? It's what I want. It's what you want." But the question goes unanswered, ultimately leaving it all open to interpretation. My overall appraisal of A Passage to India is a bit difficult to articulate. There's a lot to digest, and I found much of the symbolism, etc., a bit convoluted and hard to grasp, at least for a normal, non-literary scholar like me. I was very confused by the lack of tags during extended dialogue or actions, because a character was often not directly linked with an action or dialogue for many paragraphs, and it was easy to forget who was talking or doing an action. Even compared with other old novels, it was especially difficult in this one, I thought. Forster's writing style is not what I would call completely modern. It still feels a bit Victorian to me, which makes it more difficult to read for a modern reader, I think. This isn't too surprising since by the 1920s he had been writing for well over a decade. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this novel demands a lot more attention and focus to be able to catch everything. If I was reading this while I was a little tired, I found myself having to go back later to make sure I understood what had happened. However, this book addressed an issue that was not often addressed in literature at that time, and because Forster was British and had traveled to India, he had a keener understanding of the situation there than other writers. And Forster's treatment of India, not just as an exotic destination for traveling, is pretty refreshing compared to some other popular novels of that time. I'm looking at you, pulp magazines. He sees Indians not as an uncivilized people the English should look down upon, but as nuanced human beings that are just as flawed as any European. I think it's also important to note that A Passage to India doesn't completely echo the mainstream belief in the Western world today that colonialism is entirely unacceptable. Forster never condemns the British presence in India as morally wrong, but rather he seems to urge mutual understanding as the solution to the India problem. The situation was terrible there because of the attitude, but not necessarily the idea as a whole. At least that's what I took away. But the ending is ambiguous, so I recommend that you read the book for yourself and figure out your own opinion. And here's just another random thought I had. I doubt this was a conscious effort on Forster's part, but the exotic setting was perfect for 1920s readers, when far-off lands were very much in vogue. This must have played on the expectations of some readers, and I can just imagine someone expecting a romantic journey into the Indian land of jungles and tigers, and instead got a commentary on colonialism. Regardless of what I think, more qualified people have consistently ranked A Passage to India as one of the best novels of the 1920s and of the 20th century as a whole. But this review was just from a normal person, and I definitely tend to enjoy books that walk the line of meaningful, thought-provoking messages and effortless readability. Maybe I'm just too picky, but I truly did find the overall message of this novel very interesting. Well, that just about ends my ramblings about this book. Maybe there was something of substance in there, maybe not. You be the judge. I have more 1920s books lined up to read, so I'll probably make another video like this eventually sometime. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.